Hello, this is Adam Kruger, and the series is Lit Ideas, and today we're continuing our conversation on Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. We're talking about chapters 19 through 27. At the end of the last section in the second video, we were talking about how Jack had somewhat of a mental breakdown and left after Rosie's suicide. Cody, his wife, Cody, aka Neil Cassidy. We talked about how there's an alias for all of these names in the other videos. Anyways, so he had a bit of a breakdown, and he ended up traveling all the way back home, away from California. And at home, he was able to kind of recoup and reconvene and gather himself out. And of course, being with family was helpful, but the biggest thing that's helpful to him, and we see this as a theme throughout Dharma Bums in particular, and a lot of other Jack Kerouac works as well, of course. As a lot of the themes run parallel throughout most of his body, because it's all kind of one giant legend, the legend of Deloise, as he often said that he wanted to call it. But this theme that I'm referring to is the retreat back to nature, because with Kerouac, it tends to be being around other people gives him, and being around society in general, gives him a kind of anxiety, fills him with a kind of dread. He has problems coping with others, forming relationships, maintaining those relationships, and being able to just function as anything but a writer, really, and somewhat of a beatnik in the outside world. And because of this, he has to escape often. And here in the woods, in his home, in the wintertime, around Christmas, he's able to kind of reconvene and get in touch with his what he considers his Buddhist Dharma roots, and that's essentially with reconnecting with nature and trying to reframe his perception, as we talked about in before, in him trying to let go of his self and to exist as in pure consciousness, essentially. To exist as only a mind with no preconceived notions or prejudices or anything, but to take everything in and accept it, and to be nothing and to think nothing and to understand everything. And to him, as far as I can tell, this is somewhat the essence of what it means to be a Dharma bum, and what it means to practice at least his particular brand of Buddhism in a more contemporary setting, while trying to stick with some of the more archaic fundamental truths and the fundamental core of Buddhism, and relating that to his life as an artist, as a writer, as a beatnik, and combining all of those ideas. And it's through this that he's able to kind of deal with everything as he escapes within himself and within nature, and as he isolates himself from society at large, and even his family to some degree. Even though he's with them, there's really not a lot of interaction for the most parts, at least in what he documents here. It's quite clear that the time he's feeling most alive and most comfortable is when he's outside and he's by himself and he's able to reconvene his thoughts. And it is entirely possible that there are good reasons that he left out his issues with his family, because of course, as we talked about before, despite this being all stream of consciousness and all at least semi-autobiographical, more than semi, really. But there are certainly elements of his life that he doesn't talk to, his abandonment issues with his family, the fact that he's a deadbeat dad, more or less. But here he's able to center himself in this portion, and he begins to really deal with the issues that he was struggling, particularly with that of death. And he has a vision quite early on, and that Rosie was right, essentially, at least in one sense, of her view of the police state and order coming down, and death, and everyone's life being meaningless and becoming dust. And he has a real struggle with this issue, of course. And he realizes that she's right, but he realizes that she's right in a microcosm of a larger framework. Which is that when she goes away, that essentially her memory is still there, and she becomes part of the world in a more metaphysical sense, and that that all is part of everything, and it's part of the cycle of samsara. And to accept this as it really is, as he wants to, He needs to see that death is part of life, and to some extent he's able to do that here. And he even says a really great line about death transcending essentially the tree of the Buddha and the cross of Christ, because, you know, as we said before, he's not strictly just a Buddhist. He's using this framework as somewhat of a coping mechanism and somewhat of a way to kind of reframe his perception of reality and to find peace. And when he's able to do that, not only is his writing the most transcendent in those moments, but he is able to be one with everything and accept everything and be happy and content as he is with, you know, his dogs, especially when he's out in the woods, especially the dog of his brother-in-law, whose name is Bob. And he loves, and he says if he did nothing else during this winter or this season, that he was Saint Ray of the dogs, and he learned that dogs are better than all of us, which is what I've been saying for years. My two dogs, Bramley and Tully, they're by far better than all of you guys. You really can't compete. And it's actually the dog that ends up being somewhat of a crux between him and his brother-in-law, which is kind of representative of the greater conflicts he's having with his family. And his brother-in-law saying that he invested too much in this dog monetarily to have him off the leash. You know, whereas Kerouac just wants everything to be free and alive and all together, and while it certainly is too idealistic at times, he really struggles with that more rigid definition of society and those norms at the times. You know, keep in mind this is 1956, and we also see some of those other conflicts existing when he runs into townies and them not understanding how he doesn't have a job, how he just hangs out and reads poetry and writes in the woods and exists with animals. And, you know, it's at these points that he's the happiest, and he says that there are prejudices against him for those reasons. He says they don't really weigh on him. I think at other points he does. It certainly does, but at this point he definitely seems to be finding peace. But it's a fleeting one, because of course the issue with his brother-in-law and with the dog and with the greater conflicts within his family. He's eventually driven back out, and then during a midsection in this range, 19 to 27, as I said, he goes through some of the more regular routine Kerouac-isms, of which there's less to break down thematically, because it's more of him, you know, going to Mexico, hitchhiking, being on the road, partying, smoking marijuana, drinking, hanging out. And it's all beautiful and fun and interesting and poetic and moving. But again, it's all, in that section, it's pure action. There's not as much thought that he's infusing it all with, which happens later, especially when he's trying to really explore these Buddhist ideals. And actually, when he reconvenes with Jaffe, you know, his past hero, still best friend, but someone who is continually humanized as he's kind of stripped away of the more, you know, godlike or saint-like personifications and trappings that he's initially introduced to us with in the novel. But they have a big tiff of sorts of Jaffe saying that Kerouac doesn't live in the world enough, essentially, saying that, you know, he's all thought, that he's all words, that he's not action. And, you know, to a certain extent this is true, you know, and I think this is true very much of Kerouac in a lot of ways, because like a lot of writers, you definitely get this very strong impression that he feels like he's somewhat of a fly on the wall of his own life, and that he's watching everything by him, and he's only engaged in it on a peripheral level. He's more just trying to understand everything so that he can recreate it, so that he can express himself, and so he can have this kind of reciprocal relationship with reality, in which he's taking in and providing forth and trying to challenge, you know, his idea of what the world is. Because again, he goes into this idea time and time again in this book of trying to exist in a state of pure consciousness, of not thinking. But it's also worth noting that he tends to do this, as I've mentioned, to alleviate suffering more than anything, because there is a time when he's in the woods before he leaves, in which he's talking about just being completely glad and happy and one with everything, and he becomes bored of thinking nothing, and he becomes tired of following the path of the Dharma and the Buddha and he begins to let his mind wander. As he is one with nature, and of course he sees this as a gray area in relationship between those two things. But it does become evident that he needs to be part of the world, and that not being part of the world at all for extended periods of time brings about this existential angst, which he's always trying to deal with, and which is always driving him back into the world in some capacity, but which he always retreats from again, because he has a very difficult time dealing with this, and he's always looking for new frameworks and ways in which to survive and to exist in part of the world. And we see later in his work, of which he talks about here, because Jaffe ends up getting him this job as a lookout on Desolation Peak, which he wrote Desolation Angels about, which is the novel immediately following this. It's far more experimental, far more poetic. The prose is better. There's less going on. It's more of just his pure thoughts and him trying to capture the essence of living a solitary life on Desolation Peak on top of that mountain. And even though he's one with nature, then he also becomes extraordinarily isolated and psychologically unstable. We don't see this again so much within Dharma bums, but we see these paradoxes in Kerouac's larger body of work of his relationship to the world and his struggle to exist in the world while simultaneously trying to be a fly on the wall, trying to not exist, trying to devolve the self and devolve his wants and to let go of suffering and desire and to just exist and to understand everything purely as it is. But again, he can only do this for periods because once again he goes back to Jaffe after traveling around, going to Mexico, partying, etc. And he does see that Jaffe's changed, but in other ways he's of course stayed the same. He meets another young couple of Dharmas that they stay with, Sean and Christine. Sean's a 22-year-old. He's a young guy, obviously, although Kerouac views him as a patriarch of sorts and a very old-time, classic kind of archetype in that sense. And Christine, she mostly exists. That's my dog. Tolly, stop it. She's cute. And this brings into mind another piece of criticism. That's my dog. She's being less cute. Tolly, come here. Anyways, I'd really like to continue with this. So I only have a few more thoughts. It's tough. She's a 5-month-old puppy. What are you going to do? But anyways, what was I just saying? Oh yes, one of the criticisms of Kerouac, which brings to mind the character of Christine, is the female characters in a lot of his books aren't fully fleshed out, and they kind of exist in somewhat stereotypical roles of the time for the most part. The books like Teresa and even Megan Cassidy are an exception to that, but it is a noteworthy criticism of Jack and his works. And he's often lauded as somewhat of a sexist. And while I'm sure that he may be tainted with some slightly misogynistic views that's reflective of the culture and the time and place in which he grew up, it's important to keep in mind that he actually was very progressive-minded for at least his time. That's also, I think, worth noting that I don't think he has any ideas of being better than women. I think more than anything, he fails to understand women. And this is a trope that we see time and again throughout his relationships of not being able to fully connect with them, not to be able to be completely honest with them. We're going to pick this up in the next video as we talk about the last couple of chapters, 27, while I go take care of my dog. And again, have a good day. We're going to be talking about chapters 18 or so until the end of the book for Dharma Bums, and that'll be the last of this series before we get into Colson Whitehead's epic, beautiful, Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Underground Railroad.